The frost on the tarmac shimmered under the low winter sun, its glare bouncing against the dull gray skin of Jesse's F-35A Lightning II. The jet squatted at the edge of the forward base runway, panels open, hoses and cables stretching from ground units like lifelines. Steam rolled from the de-icing rigs, enveloping the aircraft in shifting white plumes that curled away on the wind. Jessie stepped into the thin Himalayan air, each breath sharp in her lungs despite the thermal lining of her flight suit, and she made her way toward the ladder with a steady, measured pace. The ground crew moved with quiet efficiency, their words muffled by the layers of balaclavas and face masks, their gloves stiff from the cold. Frost clung to the fabric of their uniforms and to the edges of their headgear, creating a crust that caught in the sun. One crewman knelt by the nose gear, checking tire pressure with a gauge that clicked faintly in the stillness between gusts. Another worked on the wingtip pod, his shoulders hunched against the wind that spilled down from the peaks beyond the base. Inside the cockpit, Jessie lowered herself into the seat, the harness straps already warmed from the cabin heaters. She began the pre-flight checklist from memory, fingers moving across switches with deliberate control. Oxygen systems came online, the steady hiss in her headset confirming pressure stability. The heads-up display glowed against the canopy's cold glass, its green symbols crisp against the blue-white glare of the morning. Radar sweeps came back clear, though she noted the occasional flicker in the returns. The briefing still lingered in her mind. The weather cell that had been gathering on the far side of the range was now expected to roll in within 2 hours. By the time the sun dipped, the passes would be closed under a whiteout. Command wanted imagery and sensor data from the disputed valley before that happened. The mission was simple in design but unforgiving in execution. She would fly the route, gather intelligence, and be on final approach before the storm sealed the mountains. The gusts that struck the runway came in hard and crosswise, rattling the boarding ladder as she pulled her helmet into position. She glanced toward the horizon, where the peaks stood like jagged teeth under a pale sky. Shadows stretched long over the snowfields, broken only by the glint of ice where sunlight struck the cliff faces. The peaks seemed to grow taller with each look, their edges razor-sharp against the thin atmosphere. Clearance came through her headset, and Jessie advanced the throttle. The twin intakes roared as the lightning began to roll, wheels hammering over the ice-slick pavement. She corrected against the crosswind, keeping her nose true as the airspeed indicator crept upward. The nose lifted. The rumble beneath her faded, and the cold blue sky opened ahead. Almost immediately, ice began to gather at the canopy edges, fine fractals creeping into her peripheral vision like frost under glass. Climbing over the first ridgeline, she kept her altitude steady to avoid creating a visible contrail against the crisp sky. The terrain fell away sharply, revealing valleys filled with shadow and wind-blown snow. The mountains caught the light in fleeting flashes, each ridge reflecting and vanishing as she passed. The airframe creaked in the cold, a sound she could feel through her boots and the seat beneath her. She trimmed the aircraft for smoother handling, adjusting yaw corrections as pockets of turbulence slammed against the fuselage. The wind here was not a single current, but a clash of air masses fighting for control over the narrow passes. The howl of the slipstream pressed against the canopy, rising and falling as she banked into her route. Every movement of the stick sent the horizon tilting, the mountain peaks sliding from view before leaping back into sight. The first pass brought her over a plateau where the snow lay undisturbed, broken only by the black scars of rock that jutted through the surface. Her cameras and sensors captured every feature, the data feed streaming back toward the base. Even at this altitude, she could see the shifting weather ahead, thin strands of cloud beginning to coil around the upper spires of the range. The blizzard was coming faster than predicted. She marked her position and prepared for the second sweep, her focus narrowing on the mission's rhythm. Each leg of the route was a piece of a pattern, a thread that had to be woven quickly and without error. The fuel gauge read at full operational level, but she knew from experience that high-altitude burns came faster when constant course corrections were needed. The Lightning was built for stealth and speed, but the mountains demanded a different kind of flight. The ice on the canopy thickened as the minutes passed, the heating elements struggling to keep the forward view clear. She adjusted her seat position to keep her line of sight through the smallest frost-free arc. Below her, the terrain broke into a maze of ridges and gullies, the light playing across their surfaces in sharp contrast. The shadows pooled deep and black, and in them the snow seemed to vanish into another world entirely. By the time she crossed the next ridgeline, the wind had shifted, pushing her slightly off her intended line. She corrected again, keeping her mind ahead of the aircraft, thinking in terms of seconds and miles rather than minutes and distance. Every detail mattered. The feel of the stick under her gloves, the faint change in engine tone as she pushed against the cold air, the steady pulse of her own breathing inside the helmet. The environment was not simply a backdrop to the mission. It was the first opponent she faced, unpredictable and without mercy. The blizzard on the horizon was more than weather. It was a moving wall that would decide whether she returned or vanished into the mountains. Jessie pressed forward, the jagged peaks flashing by at supersonic speed, knowing that every second here was measured against the creeping ice on the canopy and the long shadow of the storm. The first anomaly appeared as a faint flicker on the edge of her radar scope, barely more than a ripple in the steady sweep. Jessie adjusted the gain and ran a second scan, but the contact faded, replaced by the jagged clutter of mountain returns. She marked the location anyway, tagging it as potential terrain interference. In these mountains, false echoes were common, yet the brief sharpness of the blip lingered in her thoughts. The ice on the canopy was now pushing further into her forward view, forming intricate patterns that caught the weak light. The heating grid was holding the center clear, but every few minutes she had to shift her gaze to keep her sight lines open. On the heads-up display, the frost at the edges gave the glowing symbols a blurred halo, making the readouts look older, less precise. She could feel the cold pressing through her gloves now, stiffening her fingers despite the cockpit heaters running at full. She made another sweep toward the target valley, the peaks tightening on either side. The wind carried fine snow that swirled in uneven sheets, some of it striking the canopy in brief rattles that made her flinch before she steadied. The air pressure readings on the pitot system danced a fraction more than she liked, a sign that the heating element was working against conditions at its limit. She thought of the de-icing crew at the base, their hands working in freezing air, and wondered if they had known the weather would turn this quickly. Her comms crackled, a burst of static sharp enough to drown out the hum of the engine for a second. The voice of the controller at the airborne warning station came through, distorted, syllables clipped and broken by interference. She could make out only fragments about winds and altitude before the channel went quiet. She tried a second call but got nothing but the thin hiss of open air. Without the relay, her situational awareness narrowed to what her own sensors could show her. And even those were flickering. Another contact blipped on radar, this time from a different quadrant, but again it faded before the system could classify it. She checked the sensor logs, confirming the spike had been there, brief and high in contrast. The missile warning tone chirped once, a sound that cut through her helmet and sent her eyes to the threat display. But it went silent before the lock sequence completed. It was either a glitch from the interference or a probe from something out there, testing her. The valley ahead narrowed, the slopes on either side climbing into the cloud base that was sliding lower with every mile. The shadows from the peaks shifted with the wind, their shapes crawling across the snowfields like living things. She eased the throttle back a fraction, adjusting her position to make another imaging pass. A glint appeared in the far distance, sharp and metallic against the deep gray backdrop. Her focus locked on it, but within seconds it slipped into the cloud and was gone, leaving only the memory of its presence. She considered turning back, recalculating her return route in her head. The storm was moving faster than the earlier forecast. The comms were unreliable, and her fuel planning had little margin for delay. Yet the mission called for a full sweep, and this valley was the central objective. If she abandoned it now, the next chance might come after the weather passed, when visibility and terrain masking would be different. Command would want the imagery now, before anything on the ground could be moved or hidden. Her eyes moved between the fuel gauge, the radar scope, and the windshield view of the tightening pass. The air here felt heavier, the turbulence more frequent. Snow streamed in fine lines past the canopy, the motion almost hypnotic until a fresh jolt reminded her to stay ahead of the aircraft. The lightning was still smooth under her hands, but each correction took more precision as the wind found ways to shove at her from unpredictable angles. The pitot reading fluctuated again, and for a moment her airspeed indicator dipped enough to make her check the throttle setting. It held steady, but the reading took a long second to settle back into range. She thought of the early training flights where every system worked flawlessly. And how different it was out here, where cold, wind, and terrain constantly tried to dismantle the perfection of design. Out here, control was never absolute. It was borrowed, and it could be taken back at any time. She shifted deeper into the narrow glacier valley, the walls closing in and the ceiling lowering. The ice along the canopy edges thickened into sharp ridges of frost, each one a reminder of time running out. In her mind, she marked the line she was crossing. Turning back was the safer choice, but she eased the throttle forward instead, pressing into the valley's throat with the knowledge that whatever was waiting ahead would not reveal itself unless she gave it reason to. The first shadows had already found her. They came out of the clouds without warning, sliding into her rear quarter with the suddenness of a trap springing shut. Two angular shapes, their surfaces coated in frost that dulled the light, cut across the gray backdrop with a precision that left no doubt they had been tracking her. There were no markings, no identifying symbols, only sharp edges and muted metal reflecting the dim sunlight. Jessie's instincts reacted before thought could form, the stick pulling back as she dropped into the valley floor, where the mountains could break line of sight. Her radar returns scattered instantly, the jagged ridges scrambling the feed until it was more noise than data. She switched her focus to visual, scanning for movement against the churn of snow squalls. The missile lock warning shrieked in her headset, slicing through the roar of the engines. She thumbed the flare release, a burst of glowing countermeasures streaking away as she rolled hard to port, forcing the nose around until her ribs protested under the squeeze of the G-suit. The first missile passed wide, its contrail carving a white arc that broke apart into snow as it hit the valley air. She felt the turbulence kick from its passage, a brief shudder that rattled through the airframe. The wind shear hit almost at once, a downward slam that forced her to fight for altitude. The stall alarm joining the chorus of cockpit warnings. The edge of her vision darkened under the G-load, but she kept the stick firm, coaxing the aircraft back into stable flight without giving the pursuers a clean shot. She leveled just above the valley floor, the peaks looming on either side like the walls of a canyon. The enemy fighters spread apart, one climbing to a higher angle while the other mirrored her path in the opposite valley wall's shadow. The snow squalls warped their outlines, making them shimmer like heat haze despite the freezing air. Each time they broke cover, she could see the frost shimmering along their fuselages, the cold clinging to them like armor. The terrain was a weapon now, one she could use but also one that could turn against her with a moment's inattention. Every bank threatened to bring her wingtip too close to rock. Every climb risked exposing her to a clear radar lock. The wind hissed against the canopy, joined by the faint patter of ice crystals that swirled in the turbulence. She adjusted her position again, cutting a tighter line through the valley's twists, forcing the hostile on her flank to overcorrect. The second fighter appeared above the ridgeline to her right, briefly silhouetted against the pale sky before it dropped back into the cover of cloud. Jessie rolled left, climbing just enough to clear a rocky outcrop before banking sharply down the other side. The maneuver bought her a few seconds of concealment, enough to reset her position. The radar flickered, showing both contacts at different ranges, but the readings were inconsistent, corrupted by the interference. She caught sight of the lead pursuer again through the swirling snow, its outline clearer now that it had moved into a break in the cloud. No heat shimmer, no engine glow, only the cold geometry of its shape. Its nose tracked her as they curved in opposite arcs around the valley's edge, each pilot probing for the angle that would turn the other into a target. The standoff settled into a tense rhythm, a predator's circle slowed by the confines of the mountains. Her hands felt the stiffness creeping in from the cold, despite the gloves, each adjustment of the controls requiring conscious pressure. The frost along the canopy edges had crept further into her forward view, narrowing the band of clear glass she could use to track her opponents. The peaks flashed past at dangerous speed, their details a blur of shadow and rock. The valley floor was a ribbon beneath her, white and gray in shifting patterns as the wind swept through it. The enemy on the opposite ridgeline matched her turn for turn, neither willing to commit to the first aggressive pass. Jessie knew that in the open sky, the engagement would have followed doctrine, each aircraft trading altitude for position in a series of clean maneuvers. Here, nothing was clean. Every move was dictated by the space between the mountains, by the bursts of turbulence that could lift or drop her without warning. The airframe groaned as she pulled into another tight bank, the stall alarm chirping briefly before she leveled. She glanced at her fuel gauge, knowing the fight could not last forever. The second fighter was somewhere above, invisible in the snow curtain, waiting for its chance to rejoin the attack. The cold pressed harder against her body now, a weight as much as a temperature, and the cockpit felt smaller under the combined pressure of enemy presence and the mountain's immovable walls. This was no textbook engagement. The manuals had no section for fighting inside a frozen labyrinth where every breath was measured, where the peaks and the weather were as deadly as the aircraft on her tail. Out here, the advantage belonged to whoever could make the terrain serve them without being claimed by it. And in that moment, Jessie understood the truth of the fight. The mountains did not care who won. They would swallow the loser all the same. Jessie scanned the fuel gauge and felt the calculation tighten in her chest. At this burn rate, she could fight for a few more minutes, but the return to base would come with nothing left in reserve. The mountains ahead offered no flat ground, no place to put down if the tanks ran dry. Every maneuver from here on would have to count, each one judged by whether it brought her closer to ending the fight. The second hostile reappeared high and to her left, climbing into the thinning air above the ridgeline. Its angle told her the plan immediately. One fighter would push her from below while the other dropped in from above, forcing her into a kill zone with no escape vector. She pulled back on the stick, climbing hard into the pincer before it could close. The canopy edges streaked with fresh ice, the cold air biting into every seam in her flight gear. The climb drove her deeper into the thin atmosphere, the oxygen mask frosting along its edges where her breath condensed. Her lungs felt the strain with every draw, and the G-suit locked around her legs and torso as she fought to keep blood from draining away from her head. The turbulence up here was sharper, each jolt twisting the aircraft in ways the controls could only partially correct. The ridgelines below flickered past in glimpses between banks of cloud, each one an anchor point in the chaos. Her lead pursuer closed fast, its silhouette sharpening in the glare of high-altitude light. She saw the nose dip slightly, the telltale sign of a firing attempt, and made her decision. Throttle back to near stall, nose up just enough to crest the ridge ahead. Then let gravity and wind sheer do what training manuals would never allow. The downdraft caught her instantly, the nose pitching forward in a controlled drop that flipped her under the hostile's firing arc. The aircraft shuddered hard, the wings groaning under the rapid change in load. Her vision tunneled as the G-forces shifted direction, the edges going gray before clearing again. She rolled the lightning on its belly as she dropped, the heads-up display shifting to place the enemy in a tight targeting box. The missile tone sounded in her ears, sharp and steady, the vibration from the hardpoint running up through the seat as she released. The shot streaked upward, cutting across the hostile's attempt to bank away. For an instant she thought it would miss. But then the fighter broke violently to the side, trailing a line of dark smoke. It clawed for altitude, disappearing into the higher cloud layers. No longer pressing the attack. The second fighter hesitated, its climb arrested as if the sudden reversal had disrupted the plan entirely. Jessie leveled just above the valley crest, using the terrain to hide her radar signature while she searched for her remaining opponent. The wind at this height was colder still, the cockpit temperature falling despite the heaters. Frost began creeping into the canopy corners from inside as well as out, a reminder that the cold did not stop at the skin of the aircraft. The warning tones from the environmental systems blended with the steady wind roar, a constant pressure against her focus. She thought briefly of the risks she had just taken. The stall roll was something she had read about in older accounts, moves born of necessity in aircraft far less stable than hers. In a simulator, it was nearly always a losing gamble. Out here, in the layered currents of the mountains, it was exactly the kind of improvisation that could turn the fight. The manuals could not account for how the air shifted over a ridge, or how a downdraft could be bent to serve as a weapon. The heads-up display showed nothing but intermittent clutter, the remaining hostile somewhere beyond her visual range. She kept her course tight to the ridge, using every bend and fold of the mountains to break possible lock angles. The lightning was still responsive, but the strain of the climb and drop had pushed it into ranges where performance could change in seconds. Her own body felt the toll, the lingering ache in her ribs from the G-suit and the taste of cold metal in the back of her throat. Somewhere in the cloud above, the last enemy was deciding whether to press or withdraw. Jessie eased her throttle forward again, ready to force the choice by refusing to stay where she could be cornered. The mountains had shown her the way out once, and if she read them right, they might do it again. Out here, survival was not about speed or raw firepower. It was about knowing the air well enough to make it fight for you instead of against you. The last fighter came in low through the haze, its outline barely visible before it merged again with the swirling white. Jessie banked hard, the controls stiff in her hands as the first gusts of the blizzard punched into the valley. Snow slammed against the canopy in rattling sheets. The visibility, collapsing so fast it felt like the mountains were closing in. The heads-up display began to frost over, its symbols fading under the thin ice that crept across the glass. The warning tones blended with the howl of the wind, making it harder to separate one from the other. Her terrain radar flickered in and out, the range lines breaking apart under the interference from the storm. The only certainty now was the shadow of the peaks on either side, their jagged shapes appearing in split-second glimpses before vanishing again. She tightened her weaving path between them, each turn aimed at denying the hostile a clean shot. The turbulence struck without rhythm, one moment lifting her into the roof of the valley air, the next slamming the aircraft down toward the unseen floor. The G-suit worked in surges, squeezing hard to keep blood flow steady through each violent shift. Her gloves were slick inside from the cold sweat, and every correction of the stick felt like it came through a layer of ice. The canopy edges thickened with frost, until only a narrow forward arc remained clear enough to track her route. A missile warning lit red across the display, the tone sharp and insistent in her headset. Jessie dumped flares, the sudden bursts of heat and light cutting through the whiteout like sparks in the dark. She pushed the nose down, diving straight into the densest cloud bank she could find, trading altitude for concealment. The dive forced the lock to break, the tone vanishing as quickly as it had started. But the cost was losing what little visibility she had. The hostile's shadow reappeared above her, distorted and breaking apart in the swirling snow. It was pressing to close, its path slightly higher as it tried to hold the advantage. Jessie spotted a break in the cloud ahead where the wind had carved a vertical channel, upward. A thermal, unstable, but strong enough to give her the climb she needed. She rolled into it, feeling the sudden lift push the lightning higher in a lurching, uneven surge. The engines strained in the thin air, their tone rising into a sharper pitch that vibrated through the frame. The climb was brutal, each jolt of the thermal threatening to tip her off balance. She rode it as far as it would carry her, the ridgelines falling away beneath into a gray mass of cloud and snow. The hostile tried to follow, but wavered, its nose dipping as it fought to keep lift in the unstable air. Jessie used the altitude to slip behind another bank of cloud, giving her the break she needed to put space between them. The heads-up display's frost was now thick enough that she had to rely on the faint ghost of the symbols beneath, reading them from memory, more than from sight. The fuel gauge was deep into red, the numbers ticking down toward the line where the return trip would become impossible. Every maneuver from here on would have to serve one purpose: escape. The storm churned below, hiding the valley entirely. She angled the Lightning toward her exit vector, keeping just enough height to glide if the engines faltered. The wind tore at the fuselage, and each sudden drop in the air currents rattled through her bones. The hostile shape appeared once more in the snow behind her. But its movements were slower now, more cautious in the punishing conditions. She stayed with the thermal's last stretch until it broke apart, then let the nose dip to pick up speed. The turbulence hit again, but she held the line, keeping the peaks in her peripheral vision as guideposts. The blizzard swallowed everything else. The world reduced to the narrow space between survival and the edge of disaster. In the back of her mind, she knew the fight was not about forcing the enemy down. It was about keeping herself in the air long enough to see the storm's far side. The final glimpse she caught of the hostile was a faint silhouette twisting away into the cloud, its pursuit abandoned. Whether it had turned back for fuel or lost her entirely in the storm, she could not know. What mattered was the open vector ahead and the slim chance of making it home. With the fuel indicator hovering near its last reserve, Jessie pressed on into the white, the mountains fading from view, but their presence still felt in every shift of the air. The storm wrapped around her as she angled for home, the white so thick it pressed against the canopy like cloth. Headwind clawed at the nose, turning each mile into a slow fight against the clock and the fuel gauge. The autopilot could not hold steady in the turbulence. So she flew by hand, each correction measured and deliberate. The numbers on the fuel display fell in a rhythm she could not ignore. The last pass to the base was somewhere behind the wall ahead. She knew its shape from maps and memory, but neither could tell her how snow would change the air itself. Crosswinds pushed from the side, shoving her toward rock she could not see, then letting go so suddenly she had to counter hard. She kept altitude just high enough to buy seconds if the ground rose fast. Ice built along the air intakes, dulling the paint and thickening the edges. Heaters worked but too slowly, so she balanced throttle and temperature to keep systems in range. The canopy wept and froze again, the frost retreating only where her eyes stayed fixed. The heads-up display glowed through a thin veil of ice, its edges blurred but still readable at the center. Wind packed the mountain pass with powder that moved like waves. The wingtips shook under gusts, the airframe knocking and groaning in warning. She read the slopes as if climbing them, using their lines to guess where wind would break and swirl, one ridge at a time. She eased through the blizzard's shifting corridors. The fuel gauge began to blink, steady and patient in its warning. She ran the numbers again and saw no room for error. If the pass closed, there would be no waiting and no other way back. She had to thread it now. The crosswind near approach tried to spin her off course. She offset early, holding rudder and adjusting power as gusts surged and dropped. Runway lights flickered through the snow for only a heartbeat, but the image stayed with her. She carried it in her mind as she turned for the final descent. She came in high to clear the drift building at the threshold. Touchdown was a jolt, tires sliding across ice before finding grip, then slipping again as she eased the brakes. The aircraft slewed a fraction sideways before settling into line. Snow rose in sheets higher than the canopy as she rolled clear. Taxiing was slow, guided by instinct more than sight. Ground control's voice cracked with static but gave her enough to reach the stand. The base blurred into shadowed shapes, hangars hunched under weight of snow. When she set the brake, the cockpit felt too still, the storm's sound pressing from all sides. Opening the canopy let the night air bite deep. Frost had formed on the harness, cracking as she moved. Her breath rose in white plumes that vanished in the wind. Ground crew appeared through the swirl, ladders and chocks in hand, their movements quick and sure. Inside operations, heat hit her like a heavy coat. Her hands tingled as circulation returned, the ache running up her forearms where the G-forces had worked them raw. The ready room smelled faintly of coffee and thawing gear. She set her helmet down, scraping frost from the mask edge with her thumb. The debrief moved through headings, altitudes, and storm reports before the helmet footage came up. Snow streaked the lens, mountains shifting like living walls. Then a shape appeared, black against the white, moving with a precision that drew the room silent. The design matched nothing in any file she knew. No markings, no familiar heat signature, only cold lines built to hide in the storm. The chase in the footage looked slower than it had felt, speed swallowed by cloud and snow. Questions came in measured order. Any unknown radio calls? None. Any colors or insignia? None. Command offered no confirmation and no denial. Analysis pending. Stand by for expanded patrols when weather permits. The officer slid a printed schedule across the table, its timing assuming the storm would break by morning. Outside, the glass showed only white. Released from the room, she felt warmth like a tide rising back into her bones. In the locker room, she sat for a moment, letting the quiet settle. Later, she poured coffee that tasted of tin and held it for the heat, more than the taste. The window was black, the storm erasing its own tracks. The aircraft she had faced seemed part of the blizzard, shaped and shielded by the mountains. Survival had been a narrow thread drawn through a pattern she could not see. She did not call it a win, only a return. The line between air and earth had been crossed, and that was enough. Plows moved in slow circles outside, their lights carving halos in the drift. Each pass of the runway vanished almost as soon as it appeared. The storm buried the field with the same patience it had shown in the air. She hung her suit to dry, water darkening the fabric where frost had melted. Boots left a pool on the mat that rippled with each gust against the wall. Closing the locker, the click echoed sharp in the stillness. Back in the ready room, the lights were soft, the space nearly empty. Steam rose from her cup, faded, then rose again. Somewhere beyond the glass, the peaks hid under the storm, and the unknown moved where no one could see. Survival carried weight, and it settled into the room with her, waiting for the next call.